In a highly publicized Liberation Day speech, Donald J. Trump, who is America's president, has announced steep tariff rates on many countries globally. And one of these targeted countries is no other than China. Trump had announced a shocking rate of over 34%. Trump justified this enormous rate because he claimed that China had tariff rates charged to the US of over 67%. Because of this, international observers were shocked. The stock market from Tokyo to New York all sank, losing trillions of dollars in value in a matter of days. But what's even worse is Beijing's response. China, for the most part, did not stand idly by. The Chinese government retaliated by imposing its own tariffs on US goods. For example, following the US increase in tariffs, China announced a reciprocal tariff of 34% on all US imports, scheduled to take effect shortly thereafter. Chinese policymakers characterized the American moves as bullying and vowed to fight to the end if further unilateral actions were taken. These actions by the United States, however, could actually pose a far more dangerous consequence to the American economy, and it could potentially lift China's international status instead of weakening it. Why do we say this? Well, it lies in three important reasons. Let's first start with the most important one. One of the biggest reasons for Trump's tariffs in making China stronger is because they could accelerate domestic innovation and self-reliance. For a long time now, Chinese policymakers have turned to a well-established strategy: invest in domestic innovation and reduce reliance on foreign technology. China has already been laying the groundwork through initiatives such as Made in China 2025 and other industrial policies that focus on high-tech manufacturing. And over the past few years, we have seen a dramatic shift in China's technological sector. They have seen their semiconductor explode in growth. For instance, here's a graph on the growth of China's semiconductor production as compared to other economies. Here, you can easily see that back in the 1990s to 2000, China wasn't really a major player in the overall semiconductor production. But as forecasted, they are now expected to have a global share of over 24% by 2025. That puts them above Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, which are Asia's leading semiconductor hubs. But how can this be, you ask? Isn't Taiwan the leading semiconductor hub? Well, yes. Taiwan is still considered the global leader in cutting-edge chip manufacturing, especially when it comes to advanced nodes, like 5 nanometers and below, thanks to companies like TSMC. However, China's rising share in overall semiconductor production doesn't necessarily mean it's overtaking Taiwan in high-end chip-making. Instead, China's growth is driven by a massive expansion in mature node chip fabrication, used in everything from household electronics to electric vehicles and industrial machinery. Put simply, China is playing the long game. While Taiwan and South Korea focus on producing the most advanced and powerful chips in the world, China is flooding the market with the kinds of chips that power everyday devices. Chips that don't require bleeding-edge technology, but are essential to nearly every modern product. And as you saw in the graph earlier, the United States and Europe used to be at the forefront of all semiconductor production, but now that their share has dwindled down, it could only mean one thing for China, and that is self-reliance. And this self-reliance does not extend only to semiconductors. It extends to a vast range of other strategic technologies as well, like electric vehicles, batteries, telecommunications, and artificial intelligence. The second problem that Trump's tariffs bring is that they push Beijing to diversify their trade partners. For a very long time, the US was a crucial market for Chinese sellers. They helped fuel the country's rapid rise as the world's factory. American consumers bought everything from Chinese electronics to clothing, creating a massive trade surplus that powered China's economic growth for decades. But in 2018, the year the first trade war began under Donald Trump, China has actively pursued diversification. For instance, here's a graph on the US imports of goods as a percentage of total imports from the world. As you can see, From the early 1990s all the way up to the late 2010s, the share of US imports from China rose steadily. It peaked around 2017 to 2018, just before the trade war fully escalated. During this period, China had become deeply embedded in American supply chains, supplying everything from smartphones to furniture at extremely competitive prices. But after the implementation of tariffs in 2018, that long-standing growth trend began to reverse. The graph clearly shows a sharp decline starting around 2019, continuing through the COVID-19 pandemic and into the 2020s. By 2023, the US had significantly reduced its import reliance on China. This is not just the result of tariffs, but also the combined effect of supply chain disruptions, rising labor costs in China, and increased geopolitical distrust. If we were to graph out the total exports of China, however, we get to see that, despite losing a share in overall US imports, their exports have continuously grown. There was a slight contraction in 2023, but in the overall trend, China's exports are still on an upward trajectory. This could mean that it has successfully diversified its export markets and is no longer as reliant on the United States as it once was. Then, thirdly, it is also important to know that Trump's tariffs have pushed China to strengthen their own alliances. For instance, we have seen the rise of BRICS over the past few years. BRICS has grown from just a symbolic economic bloc into a platform for real geopolitical coordination and economic cooperation, especially among countries that want alternatives to Western-led institutions like the IMF or World Bank. Originally composed of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the group has recently expanded to include other nations such as Egypt, Iran, Ethiopia, and the UAE, and continues to attract interest from dozens more. There have even been so many reports where foreign nations like Russia, Saudi Arabia, Argentina, Brazil, and so on have been using the Chinese yuan either for trade or as part of their foreign currency reserves. So, as you can see, Trump's tariffs have done far more than just raise the prices of imported goods. They've triggered a global economic realignment. What was initially intended as a pressure tactic to weaken China's trade dominance ended up accelerating several long-term trends that may ultimately strengthen China's position in the global order. Now, we got to talk about the impacts of Trump's tariffs to the US and Chinese economy. The reason why this is important is because while tariffs may have hurt the Chinese economy, it is also going to hurt the US economy. You can look at this from the US side. When tariffs were implemented, Trump was hoping to bring back manufacturing jobs. But if we were to graph out the total employees in the manufacturing industry of the United States, we get to see that total employees rose, which some may assume that the US manufacturing sector is back on track. But in reality, if we graph out the manufacturing value added as a percentage of GDP, we get to see that it has continued to go down. This is because instead of bringing back manufacturing home to the US, what happened is that American investors and companies simply shifted their supply chains to other countries, not necessarily back to the US. In other words, US tariffs didn't bring back manufacturing jobs home. They led companies to move operations to places like Vietnam, Mexico, India, Thailand, and even Eastern Europe. And along the way, it actually led to higher input costs for businesses, increased consumer prices, and disrupted supply chains. One of the most appealing ways to view this is in the new iPhone price. When Trump initiated his Liberation Day tariff, many reports surfaced about the new iPhone cost. One report that has been circling around the news lately is that the cost of an iPhone 16 Pro would rise by 54%. The cost of the iPhone prior to the tariff was $549.73. But after factoring in tariff costs to Taiwan, China, South Korea, Japan, and all other components, they would rise to over $846.59. This cost would most likely be passed on to consumers, and in doing so would prove that tariffs don't just hurt foreign producers, they hurt American consumers too. Now, as of the latest news, Trump has decided to implement a 90-day pause. In a significant policy shift, President Donald Trump has announced a 90-day pause on most tariffs, reducing the general reciprocal tariff rate to 10%. However, tariffs on Chinese imports have been sharply increased to 125%. But since they have been changing rapidly, only time will tell just how impactful Trump's policies will be for China and the US. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.